Next up, we have a different type of scope called Lexical Scope. This one's pretty simple and straightforward. When we have nested functions, which we sometimes do, maybe not at this point with what we're writing, but later on, and if you learn things like React, you'll have nested functions all the time. If I have a nested function like the one I have here, or the two functions, I have outer, and inside of it, I've defined another function called inner. Outer has a variable called hero. Hero is defined in this function. I don't have access to it outside of that function, but if I am nested further in a different function, I still have access to hero. So I'll demonstrate this briefly. We'll just go with inner and outer. So function outer, and then we'll have function inner. And in the outer function, we'll declare a variable. We'll call this movie equals Amadeus. Great film, great film. And then in inner, let's access movie. Let's console.log movie.toUppercase. So at this point, how do I actually run inner? If I run outer, I'll run the code over here and I call outer. It doesn't return anything. All that it does is declare a variable, and then we have a function declaration. We're writing a function, we're declaring it, but we're never calling it. So if I execute inner from inside outer, let's try it again. Now it is successfully console.logging Amadeus in all caps. Movie was not defined in this function, it was defined in its parent, in the outer function right here. Secondary to this, what if I tried to call inner from outside this function? I don't have access to it. It's just like I declared a variable inside of outer. I declared a function. It's called inner. I don't have access to it over here. I only have access to it inside of outer, unless I were to return the function, which is something we'll see later on. So if I call inner from inside outer, this is getting confusing with the naming here. If I execute outer, it declares a variable movie, sets it to Amadeus. It knows about a function. We declare the function, we define it here, inner, and then we call it. So when it's called, it console.logs movie. It does not have a movie defined in here, so it will look for a different movie from the scope of the parent function, which is called outer. So lexical scope refers to the fact that nested functions are lexically bound. They're bound to the scope of their parent or of their outer functions. But it's a one-way relationship. It doesn't work the other way around. If I were to define a variable in here, let x equals 10, I do not have access to x outside that function. Just like with regular function scope we've seen earlier on, if I run outer, we get Amadeus from the inner function running. The variable is successfully declared in inner, but I don't have access to it out here. So a variable declared in one function is available to nested functions within it. And then finally, if I were to declare movie in this function, a different movie, let's say movie equals, what's another good movie? How about The Shining? What do you expect to happen here? When we call inner from inside outer, so when I execute outer, it will declare movie in the scope of this function called outer. Then we execute inner, and inner defines its own version of movie called The Shining. That's the value. And then we're going to print movie.toUppercase. Which movie is printed? The Shining. Behind the scenes, the thought process, if you want to think of it that way, inside of this function is when we reference movie, it's going to look to see, is there a movie in this function? Is there a movie defined in this scope? If it doesn't find it, it will look further up. Is there a movie defined up here? And if there is, then it will use that. So we could go one level further as an example. So we'll have movie Amadeus, movie The Shining, and then in here I'll do another inner function. I'll call this one extra inner. And we'll console.log movie.toUppercase in here. And I'll make sure I call extra inner. So this is a very weird pattern, what I'm doing right now, but it illustrates the principles at play. So when I call outer, we define movie to Amadeus in the scope of the outer function. Then we execute inner. In inner, we define movie right here with the value of The Shining. Then we execute extra inner. extra inner does not have a movie defined inside, so it will look up to the nearest scope, which is the inner function, and use that value. So if I run outer, we get the shining. If I were to comment this out, we don't get an error. It just continues up past inner. It doesn't find movie, so it looks up again. Does it find movie there? And it does. And that's pretty much it. When you have a nested function, you have access to the variables declared in the scope of the parent function. And that continues down as many levels as you need to nest. This seems like it might be useless or not that useful, but as I mentioned, if you use things like React later on, you define functions that represent a component on your page. So you could have a function called to-do list. And in that to-do list component, you might have different variables like let to-dos equals an array and let username equals something. Then you would have different functions for that to-do list. You might have one called add to-do. If I can spell to-do, you might have another one called remove to-do and another one called update to-do, and they might use to-dos and username in their function bodies. So we're grouping it all together into a to-do list function because that's what React wants, but we still break up our code, our functionality, into smaller pieces, and we have access to those variables declared in the outer function. Okay, so that's Lexical Scope.